Well, a very warm welcome to everybody. I'm Vicki Treadell, the British High Commissioner, and it's fantastic to actually be in the company of so many people. I think in the last few months we've not been used to being in company. So it's great to be able to socialise and see so many of you, even though we still have to do a bit of social distancing. We have a fantastic panel this evening, who I will introduce in a minute. But first of all, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country, the land on which we meet, the Ngunnawal people, their elders past, present and future, and indeed to acknowledge all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and anyone who is here with us today, their leaders past, present and future. And on the theme of COP26, I think one of the most important elements will be the Indigenous Forum that we will be hosting as well next November, not least to look at nature-based solutions and the things that we have forgotten in terms of guardianship and looking after the land and the rivers and the sea. So a very warm welcome. I'm now going to sit down. I have bits of paper here that I will try to glance at. But before I introduce the panel, it's fantastic to be able to host this with ANU's Climate Change Institute. Thank you for your partnership and for being such terrific collaborators in this evening's event. And once we've had our chat, we will watch the incredible film David Attenborough's A Life on Our Planet. You know, he is 95, he's one of our greatest institutions in the UK, and about 3 years ago, we have an annual event, we didn't have one this year, where all British ambassadors and high commissioners gather in London for our annual conference. We reflect on the world, what the challenges are, and then we'll come back to our respective missions to continue the work. But the highlight of that conference was our final closing keynote speaker, and it was Sir David himself, with such great passion about the world that he has observed, the natural order, the flora and fauna, from the Amazon rainforest through to Pacific Islands, the marine ecology and more. And he told us all that one of the greatest priorities for the British Foreign Service, because we knew that we were aiming to be the host of COP26, was the challenge, and climate diplomacy should be a #1 priority for us. At the end of his tour de force for an hour, every single one of us in that room, something like 180 British ambassadors and high commissioners, gave him a standing ovation. I hope you will get a sense of that when you watch the film. He was really quite remarkable. And the thing about his observation, and as you will see in the film later, is that if nature and the natural order is given a chance, it can come back. Without giving too much away, the opening scenes of the film we're about to watch is a visit that he undertakes to Chernobyl, completely devastated by the disaster there. Yet things are coming back. Green shoots of recovery, you might say. And for us in the UK, we are serious about our climate leadership role. It's been a bipartisan issue. Successive Labour Conservative governments have put their shoulder to the wheel. We know too that it's all well and good to stand up and preach, and I know most of you in this room are the converted. So it's not about us agreeing in this room, it's about those we have yet to influence and persuade, because the arguments are forceful. But for us to have credibility, to do the work that Sir David enjoined us all to do, our climate diplomacy work, that means we have to practice what we preach at home. We have to put in the legislation that will drive the behaviours. We have to put the incentives in for business and industry to want to transform, to help us transform our economy. And there's always a great debate between, do you have targets or not? Well, in our practice, we do believe in targets, and the British government is committed to net zero by 2050. But that alone is not enough, though it does drive behaviour, and we have seen it. When we have locked in policy into legislation, it transforms the behaviour of our investors, of our business, of our industry. It attracts foreign direct investment into the UK. Right now, with policies and legislation around green technologies, 2-3 weeks ago, our Prime Minister announced work that we will do on wind power, creating 60,000 new jobs in the green sector in the UK. And I know foreign investment is flowing in to make sure that that happens. And that is happening because we have set a net zero target for 2050. We have also put into legislation, and indeed in the last few days, we have brought forward the target date from 2035 to 2030, that British car manufacturing in the UK will cease producing cars that are run on petrol and diesel. That has already seen the transformation of investment into hybrid electric vehicles and other forms of renewable energy that will drive vehicles. Because we want to have an automotive sector in 20, 30, 40, 50 years' time. So we must be at the forefront of that transformation to keep those automotive jobs, but to change them into the types of cars of the future. And the relationship between our automotive technology into aerospace and aviation, that's the great prize too. So legislation and targets do drive behaviours, but we have to look after literally our own backyard as well. And I have a hot off the press note here from my team. In the coming days, our Prime Minister will be announcing a 10-point plan, albeit from self-isolation at number 10, if you saw the news, to build back greener, aimed at creating green jobs and protecting forests. So he set an ambition for us, a 25-year environment plan at home in the UK, which commits us to protecting 30% of the UK's land by 2030. And we're putting our money where our mouth is too. A £40 million Green Recovery Challenge Fund to encourage bids to restore the natural environment, to protect our biodiversity. We have unique species too, not quite as colourful and exotic as it appears to us that you have, but still some of our precious reptiles, bird life, little dormice and creatures like that, some of our water voles, we need to bring them back to protect our biodiversity and to look at habitat restoration, preventing and cleaning up pollution. So those are things that we will be doing. And of course in partnership with our friends Italy, delivering COP26. We want high ambition for ourselves and for the world. We want everyone to think about this. But as I said before, to be able to do that, we have to walk the talk ourselves. So coming back to British High Commissioners and ambassadors around the world, we are getting rid of all our old fleet cars, and every British envoy will now drive an electric or hybrid vehicle. And that change is already taking place. So I came here in my lovely new hybrid Range Rover today, and but I have been shamed by my Deputy High Commissioner, Ingrid, who cycled here. So, let me turn to our fantastic panel and introduce each of you. And then to get the ball rolling, we want this to be interactive, and I will be reverting to this notepad here. If you want to get questions to me, please can you do what it says on the screen? Log in and start putting your questions in. Vote for the questions you think are really good. In the main, I will go for the most popular question that I will put into the panel. but we want this to be interactive over the next 30 minutes or so. Can I first introduce Dr. Sophie Lewis, the ACT Commissioner for Sustainability and the Environment. Great to see you, Sophie. Also, I'm told that Caitlyn Baljak is our representative angry young person here this evening. She doesn't seem angry at all at the moment, but I'm sure once the passion and the discussion gets going, we will see a harder edge. But it's great to have you on board, and Caitlyn is an ANU undergraduate, and she will offer us some youth perspectives on climate change. And finally, but not least, we have Dr. Zoe Leviston, social psychology researcher at ANU. Thank you very much. Let's hear it for the panel. So we always have to start with someone. So Sophie, may I begin with you? How much of our climate has actually changed in your lifetime? What have you observed? And how much more do you think is likely to change if we do nothing?
So thank you very much for that introduction, and as we'll see when we watch the film, and we see the rapidity of change that has occurred over David Attenborough's lifetime, we see huge changes that have occurred over those 93, 94 years. But when we focus on my lifetime, that's when we really start to see that fingerprint of climate change emerging so strongly. So that's changes in things like our extreme weather and climate events here in Australia, particularly increases in the frequency and severity of heat waves, changes in our rainfall patterns and our rainfall extremes, things like marine heat waves causing coral bleaching, and changes in our catastrophic fire weather. So that's, in my lifetime, is we're really starting to see that emergence of the climate change signal in that part of the climate system that we can perceive and we're so vulnerable to as part of that natural world. But one thing that really will come out when we watch the film is that the change that has occurred over my lifetime will be eclipsed by the damage that will come in decades if we don't act on climate change as rapidly as possible. So my little daughter, she's 3 years old, so when we start to look at what her life might be like by the time she's a young mum, by the time she's my age, or by the time she reaches Sir David's age, that's where we're going to start to see very serious changes in the climate system that in some places will be incompatible with the life that we know.
Thank you, sobering thoughts. And precisely what you have said, I'll come on to Caitlyn. It is your generation that will inherit the world.
Well, I guess that anxious would be a little bit of an understatement when we think about the kind of world that we are going to inherit. And as you will see in the film that you're going to watch today, and so David giving his testament about his life and what he has seen, I will give a quick testament of my own. So I was born in the Millennium Drought in a little country town about 40 minutes away from here. My parents have this wonderful photo of me in a bright red raincoat jumping around in a puddle when I'm 3. I didn't get to see rain very often, and I thought it must have been magical with how much the adults around me talked about it, particularly in a small farming community. Now that I'm older, I see that it does have almost magical abilities to replenish the land. When I was 7, we took a trip up to the Great Barrier Reef. I wanted to be a marine biologist as a child, and I wouldn't let my little legs or little arms stop me from snorkeling all day long, appreciating every creature and coral that I could get my eyes on. It was apparent to me, even then though, that something wasn't right, that there were parts of the reef that did not seem as healthy as they should be. I was 11 years old when it was the first time that I saw water in Lake George, just down the road. I thought that it must have been satire that it was called a lake because I'd never seen it as such. And I remember seeing the billions of dollars of damage televised from southeast Queensland when the La Nina of 2010 and 2011 was broadcasted on TV. I was 21 when I watched on in horror as my childhood playgrounds on the south coast burned down, along with billions of Australia's native animals in the black summer of 2019. This year was once again the hottest year on record. Of the 10 hottest years on record that Australia has experienced, only one has been before the year 2005. It was the year 1998, the year that I was born. My testament is not one of necessarily mourning the loss of a world that I have seen, because I haven't seen it. It is more so mourning the lack of vision for a future and a fear of when every summer bushfire season comes to be the same, or even worse than the Black Summer fires of 2019. My story is one of fear and anxiousness for the uncertainty that our apparent leadership has cast us into as young people, through a lack of vision from a federal government who is content to lie in the pockets of the fossil fuel lobby, and a media who is unwilling to tell the truth of the gravity of what climate change will mean for us. So even though we are anxious and full of uncertainty as young people, we are full of vigour and will to act, even on something that we did not cause ourselves. But we can't do it by ourselves, and we need people around us who are already in positions of power to help us. So I guess my testament is one of looking forward to the future, of a future that could be a lot worse than the one that Sir David has sort of seen to come, or one that could be better. So I guess that's my personal testament as a young person, and hoping that you might be able to help us along our journeys.
Thank you. Those really powerful words, and I think we felt your vision and what you have seen in your lifetime. And the challenge, I think, is how for each of us in what is left of our individual lifetimes, we can try to make a difference so that that anxiety and that fear can be eased. And that's the agenda we are set on. But you're right too, it's a societal issue. It's an issue that affects communities. And we're seeing the horizons between each climatic event and change foreshortening, and things becoming yet more extreme. And there is a social cost to all of that as well. Some of the most vulnerable are at the forefront of this challenge. So Zoe, I wonder if I can turn to you and ask you for a sort of view on societal attitudes to climate change. How have they been changing? And what more can we do?
Or have they been changing indeed? It's a really good question. It's actually a really tricky one too, because it means dabbling in the dark arts of interpreting polling data. So speaking from an Australian perspective, unfortunately we don't have great data quality on community attitudes that has been consistently applied across decades. But we can kind of create a picture of changing climate attitudes from drawing on pretty disparate but good quality data from polling like the Australia Institute, which has been going for a while now, the Lowy Institute, Gallup polls, Essential polls, some work that I was involved in back in the CSIRO, and I guess kind of triangulate how attitudes may have been changing over time. I'm pretty conservative when it comes to inferring trends from a couple of points in data. And I would always play devil's advocate in this regard, but looking at the later polling, I think it's becoming undeniable that there has been an attitudinal shift of some note in the last couple of years. So that's with relation to people who accept the scientific consensus on human contribution to accelerating climate change, but also in terms of the imperative to act urgently to address the impacts of climate change. So that's great news. I think it's becoming very apparent that the shift is on. If we look how this has changed over time, a lot of the polls you see took off in about they started it during the last decade. And I think that kind of gives a little bit of a false picture of what's been happening and just how sharp the increase in climate concern is. Because if you look at something like the Lowy Institute, which goes back into the early 2000s, you can see that what seems to have happened here is that we've reached a kind of a nadir or a low ebb in about 2011, 2012 with regards to acceptance of the scientific consensus and whether people thought it was a priority. Now, why that kind of ebbed or reached a low point in 2011-12, that's a whole different TED talk, I guess. We can speculate that, but interestingly, though, that kind of pattern of high concern in the early 2000s, diminishing towards around the 2010s, and now this increase is reflected in patterns that you see in the US and England as well. So I can't think we can't just put it down to domestic politics. So in some respects, it paints a bit of a despondent picture that you say, wow, geez, 15 years on, we're back to where we started in the early 2000s with a blip in the 2010s. But I think it's important to keep in mind that this comes off an extraordinary high baseline of pervasive concern and understanding of the urgency to do something. So the high baseline is always important to keep in mind. One other point that I would make, my own research focuses a lot on people's perceptions of Australian community sentiment and how accurate that is. So in the early 2010s we did some research showing that the Australian community grossly overestimates the amount of climate scepticism and denial within the broader Australian community, and grossly underestimates the levels of concern that their fellow country people hold. And while we see this shifting in attitudes in the last couple of years, what we find is these misperceptions of what their fellow country person thinks has not shifted. So we don't. So even though we've got these huge rises in concern, that is not reflected in people's perceptions of what the people around them think. I think that's important because if we continue to think that inaction and unconcern and scepticism is rife in a community where it's actually in reality a fringe attitude, then that has knock-on consequences to what we think that we can do to collectively mitigate and adapt to climate change. It maybe makes us less hesitant to speak out in social surroundings and participate in collective action. So that is a real shift in community attitudes that I would like to see going forward.
Can I ask a follow-up question? How do you think you get that shift?
Well, we know it's from the research that people have done trying to change people's attitudes in scientific consensus around climate change. It's not, the deficit approach model where we just say, oh, people just need to understand and be told the actual figures. That in itself is not enough. There are various psychological reasons why we might want to misperceive what other people are thinking, because it makes us feel better about ourselves, makes us think that we're doing more than we actually are. We can thumb our nose at people saying, oh, they don't even science, these people can't science, how silly are they? But it gives us this kind of false sense that we're contributing more to a problem than we actually might. So understanding the functions that misperceiving what other people think and do is a very important part in trying to overcome some of the misperceptions that people have. But yeah, the figures show that climate concern, acceptance of the science, and acceptance that it's an imperative is the mainstream. That is the mainstream position of Australians.
Thank you. Caitlyn, your lived experience, you gave us those vignettes from different points in your life, ending with last year's bushfires, which was breached into this calendar year. Of your generation, what is the frustration that we hear from Zoe that it's a mainstream view that climate is the most significant threat? But how do we galvanise politicians who believe it's a vote winner?
So I think that lobby groups might have something to do with how certain politicians perceive the severity of issues or the ability to sort of hide how the public feels about those issues, and I think that the media also has a big role to play in the truth-telling that hasn't occurred about the severity of climate change, not just on the sort of, climate impacts to our natural environments, but as Zoe's also said, in telling the truth about how many Australians do support, effective, meaningful climate action, because that story is not getting out. So people might feel that their opinions are marginalised, or that they themselves, it's not the right time to act on climate change because not everyone else around me is doing it, and that doesn't help with action. So it's sort of those top levels of leadership that we're not seeing to back up how Australians feel about these things to take that action, which is something that young people are getting really frustrated about, and I think that's probably why we've seen events such as the climate school strikes. They've been pretty active in Canberra as well. Some of you might have participated, some of you might have seen them around. And we're looking for other ways that we can act on climate change, because we left the discussion about whether climate change is or is not happening and who's causing it, like in the past, ages ago as young people. Even as a little girl, I knew that this was happening to us. And so we're looking for alternative ways that we can sort of get around power to be able to make meaningful action on climate change.
Thank you. I'll now turn to some of the questions from our audience. The points you have both made are really around sort of ambition and how that translates into action. So the first question, the most popular one that has a number of thumbs up from others, is, is 2050 for net zero not ambitious enough? Why not 2025? And posing, can't we actually foreshorten the horizon there? Perhaps Sophie, do you want to tackle that one first?
So I suppose that really identifies that it's not just the time frame for that end goal, it's interim targets that are incredibly important, and that we have to be focusing on our greatest ambition in terms of at what date we meet particular reductions. So there's definitely a role to be played there for the interim targets. And when we see jurisdictions such as the ACT, where we do have hugely ambitious climate change mitigation policies, ideally that encourages other jurisdictions to take on those actions, and it also creates the space for that to occur. So as you said in your wonderful preamble, that by creating that environment, that's where you create all that follows after that in terms of technology, in terms of industry, in terms of jobs, and that's what we need to be doing. So yes, we definitely need more ambition rather than less. We need those timeframes to be collapsed closer to now, but we also have interim targets in which we can do that.
Great, thank you. Caitlyn.
I mean, it would be nice if we could get the federal government to commit to a target in the first instance. That is my comment on it.
Thank you. Zoe.
Oh, I don't know the right person to necessarily comment on it, but there's from psychology, there's things like the door in the face technique or the foot in the door technique. That if you give someone an unreasonably ambitious target to reach, and then scale back from that and give them maybe a more feasible target, then suddenly you'll get a massive amount more support for the feasible target than if you just introduce the feasible target alone. Not to kind of over-pathologise how climate negotiations happen, yes, I think by moving the ambition, that you move what is normative as well, and what is reasonable in people's minds. So
yes, and perhaps I would also add, targets are all fine, but it's also about the transition of economies. So it touches on your point, Zoe. It has to be realistic, because you have to carry people with you. People have to see what those alternative jobs are going to be. And business and industry has to evolve and move on. In fact, it'll come on to the next question. So we're seeing fossil fuel companies, and I'll pick a British one, BP, who is transitioning to become a renewable energy company. But that time takes time to reinvest, to develop the new technology, to transition the skills of your workforce. And I guess the challenge is how quickly can you realistically do that without other consequences. These are difficult trades, but I do think if you set a target, you can revise those targets as a result of seeing actually things are happening at a faster pace. So one of my opening examples of our target, original target of 2035, to transform the British car manufacturing industry, I think because of the investment we have seen and the speed at which some of that new technology is coming through, and because the automotive industry itself in the UK has embraced it, we're bringing that target forward by 5 years. So cutting off 5 years and making it 2030. So a date, a line in the sand is something to aim for, but if you can finish the race faster, I guess at that next COP, and we see how we track. But that means keeping the foot, and that's the wrong analogy, I was going to say the foot on the pedal of an electric vehicle, and making sure that, you know, we are at the right pace and things are achievable and you carry society and the economy in order to have the money to invest.
I don't disagree with that, but I do think we could be expecting more in terms of ambition from business, and we've talked all about the vast vacuum of leadership in terms of federal politics in Australia and the lack of targets and the failure of future generations. But that's just one side of power and one side of leadership. So I think when we look to business, we could be demanding and expecting more from them. And there are some fantastic examples of businesses who are being hugely progressive in this space. But if we look at the business sector in general, I think COVID really did demonstrate that when things need to be done quickly, they can. And that there is great creativity and agility and ambition in great business minds. And we should be, as consumers, demanding that of businesses that we engage with.
Well, business are important stakeholders, yes. And working with them so that they are part of this agenda. So I use BP as an example, and that sort of links to this current most popular question: how do we counter the lobbying power of the mining fossil fuel interests on the current government, or indeed governments everywhere? I don't know if anyone wants to have a shot at that. But we're doing a whole series of events, and one of the events, I can't remember what date it is, I think it's the 24th, with a youth engagement discussion. We have the sustainability officer from BHP on our panel, so I shall make sure we keep that question and ask her to answer it. But these are the conversations we're having, because we need fossil fuel extractive industry companies to be part of the solution. Caitlyn, a thought?
Yeah, well, these businesses don't want to end up with stranded assets. It's bad business. It's bad business when shareholders start pulling out their shares because they don't see a future in a company that is not going to be relevant in sort of, 20, 30 years' time, or hopefully even sooner, because of the transitions that we're making now. So it's also a part of us as being consumers that you have to put your money where your mouth is when it comes to companies and responsible investing. And a really good way that you can do that, for instance, is change your super. Tell your super fund that you don't want them to invest in fossil fuels and take your super elsewhere, because that is a pretty small effort on your behalf that can make a big difference in the scheme of things with how much money is invested in Australian super, to send a message to businesses that we don't think it's acceptable to be supporting the fossil fuel or a high carbon economy.
And that leads me nicely to the next question. What is the most important contribution change we can each individually make to reduce our impact on climate change? So that's a great example. Make sure your super, or indeed your bank, or where you yourself invest, if you do, that those providers for you are actually ones that see the power of the customer and where you put your money. So let's ask each of you personally what you're doing to reduce your impact.
Oh gosh,
gosh, I wasn't expecting that. I didn't prepare for that. Just catching public transport, changing my diet, composting, etc., which all seem relatively inconsequential in the grand scheme of things, which I think is a big challenge for people to get their head around. But in terms of individual action and impact, I think it depends on, we have to be careful not to fall into the trap of asking the most from people who don't have necessarily the means to change behaviour. From what I understand, and I'm possibly talking out of my area a bit, but in terms of just an everyday contribution, one of the most impactful things that you can have from a day-to-day perspective is to change your diet. And it doesn't mean you're flipping to veganism overnight, but it means being just more mindful when it comes to what you're consuming, where it comes from, and so on. And it feels almost trite because it's like, well, how can a change in my diet, one person's diet, make such a difference? But in terms of emissions reduction, it is something very impactful that collectively sends, a whole cascade of market signals to the way we produce our food and what we use our, arable land for, and so on. That's one thing.
They're all really good individual actions. I think the thing that I do is I just don't stop talking about climate change, and you both mentioned that how important this is, that to be, I own a car, I do all the normal things, I go on a plane on holidays, but I'm concerned about climate change, and I'm deeply concerned about my daughter's future, and that is things so that other people have the capacity and are empowered to talk about how worried they are too. I think that is a really important thing that we can all be doing, and particularly I've seen some young people in the room. I saw a North Ainsley primary school uniform. The young people talking about how concerned they are about climate change is even more important than me talking about it.
Yeah, so I sort of think the personal responsibility argument is kind of crap, because you as an individual are not solely responsible for climate change, right? There are a lot of big businesses who could have a lot bigger impact on climate change mitigation than you as an individual can. So I really sort of back what Sophie has said about using your voice to tell businesses that you as a shareholder don't think it's acceptable that they're doing what they're doing. Because when, lots of shareholders withdraw their support for businesses, or when it doesn't become popular to support businesses that are sort of investing and taking out their business ventures this way, then that changes what they're doing and has a much bigger impact on climate change than you as an individual sort of living as a, monk giving up all your worldly possessions.
Thank you. There's always a balance. We need actually big business, small business, and individuals too. For our part, in my own small way here, in plastic cling film instead of coals, for example. I've also already mentioned what my organisation is doing, but we took a policy decision 3 years ago to eliminate single-use plastic globally. So, try to source things that that are not single-use plastics. We invest in making sure that our properties are energy efficient. So at my residence, which I think other diplomats do as well, making sure we have solar to heat our water. And one of the things that I'm personally, one of my projects since I arrived, was to develop our own little sort of kitchen garden to grow our own seasonal fruits and vegetables. I'm hoping to make the business case to invest in rainwater harvesting when we do get rain, so I can do irrigation with the rainwater instead of off the mains, because water security and water capture is a big climate challenge. So there are a few examples. I realise we are now at the hour that we have to draw this panel to a conclusion. There are many more questions here that I'm sorry we've not been able to get onto. But on one of them here, in what ways can Australia and Great Britain form stronger ties to help bring about change in our climate? For those of you who saw the headlines last week, Prime Minister Johnson did talk to Prime Minister Morrison, and he did raise some of the trickier issues. We are going to explore coming up with a technology partnership and how we can work together to get the investment. And this comes back to the point about talking with business and industry about their own transformation and what that new economy can look like and is realistic and can be reached. So I hope that provides an answer to that question. But I think we now need to watch the film. If we needed even further inspiration other than that these three wonderful women have given us. Thank you very much, each of you. And